The stage lights were warm, but the boy standing at the center felt cold all the same. He shifted his weight slightly, the thin soles of his worn shoes barely muting the chill of the polished floor beneath him. His jacket, 2 sizes too big and frayed at the cuffs, hung on his narrow shoulders like a borrowed life. This place did not belong to him. Everyone could see it. And he knew it too. His name was Liam O'Connor, and before this moment, no one had ever spoken it into a microphone. He had learned to keep his head down in Dublin streets, where people looked through him as if he were part of the pavement. Nights were the hardest. He slept near bus stations or under shop awnings, curled tight against the wind, listening to the city breathe while hunger gnawed at his chest. Music was the only thing that made the hours pass. When the cold became unbearable, he sang quietly to himself, not for money, not for attention, but to remember that he was still alive. Now, under the weight of thousands of eyes, his hands shook. One of the judges leaned forward and asked him where he came from. The question was simple, but it landed like a stone. Liam swallowed, his throat dry, and for a moment it seemed like no sound would come out at all. Then he spoke, his voice soft and cracked, carrying years of things he had never said out loud. He didn't talk about dreams or fame. He talked about not having a home. About singing to stay warm. About believing that if he stopped singing, something inside him would disappear forever. The room changed as he spoke. The audience, restless only seconds ago, fell into a deep, aching silence. One judge pressed their lips together, eyes shining. Another looked down at the table, fingers clenched, as if trying to hold back something breaking inside. This was no longer an audition, it was a confession. Liam stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, waiting for rejection because rejection was familiar. He had known it all his life. But as the silence stretched, something else crept into the air, a fragile hope, trembling and dangerous. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. For the first time, people were truly listening. The first note drifted through the theater like a memory waking up. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't polished, but it carried a weight that made people lean forward without realizing they had moved. Liam closed his eyes as he began to sing, not because he was nervous, but because this was how he always sang, alone, in the dark, where the world couldn't see how much it hurt. His voice cracked on the opening line, and instead of breaking the spell, it deepened it. There was no imitation in his tone, no attempt to sound like the original. Every word of Hotel California came from somewhere lived in, somewhere scraped raw by nights without shelter and days without being chosen. When he sang about being tired, it wasn't a lyric, it was a confession. When he sang about searching for rest, it was a plea. The judges exchanged glances, startled by how quickly the performance had taken hold of them. One of them lifted a hand to their mouth, eyes wide, as if witnessing something they weren't prepared for. Another leaned back in their chair, blinking rapidly, fighting tears that refused to stay hidden. The audience sat frozen, caught between breathing and listening, afraid that even a cough might shatter the moment. Liam's hands trembled as he held the microphone, but his voice grew steadier, stronger, as if the song itself were holding him up. He sang like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to say. On the line about mirrors on the ceiling, his brow furrowed, as if he were staring into reflections of all the lives he might have lived if things had gone differently. When he reached the words about checking out but never leaving, his voice dropped to a near whisper, and that whisper cut deeper than any shout. A tear slipped down one judge's face, unnoticed at first, then another followed. The emotion in the room had turned physical, heavy, pressing against every chest. People in the audience reached for strangers' hands without looking, connected by something they couldn't explain. As the final notes stretched and faded, Liam opened his eyes. For a brief second, fear returned, fear that the silence meant failure. But this silence was different. It was thick with awe, trembling on the edge of release. His last breath into the microphone sounded less like an ending and more like a soul finally setting something down. For a heartbeat after the final note disappeared, nothing moved. The silence wasn't empty, it was charged, humming with everything that had just been felt and couldn't yet be understood. Liam stood frozen, microphone still near his lips, his chest rising and falling too fast. Old instincts told him to brace for dismissal, for polite smiles that hid indifference. His shoulders tightened, ready to shrink back into himself. Then a chair scraped loudly against the floor. One of the judges stood up so suddenly it startled the others, hands pressed flat against the table as if they needed support to stay upright. Their eyes were glassy, red-rimmed, and unashamed. Another judge followed, wiping tears openly from their face, shaking their head in disbelief. The third judge remained seated only for a second longer before covering their mouth, overcome, breath catching in a quiet sob. The audience sensed the shift before it fully happened. A collective intake of breath, a ripple of anticipation moving through the room. Without warning, a hand slammed down. The sound of the golden buzzer cut through the air like thunder. Golden confetti exploded from above, raining down in blinding waves of light. Gasps turned into screams. Cheers crashed over the stage in a roar so loud it felt physical, like a force pushing forward. Liam flinched, then looked up as gold swirled around him, sticking to his hair, his jacket, his trembling hands. His mind couldn't catch up with what his eyes were seeing. His knees gave way. He dropped to the floor, clutching the microphone as sobs tore out of him, raw, uncontrolled, years of survival breaking open all at once. One judge rushed the stage, pulling him into a fierce embrace, whispering words that were lost beneath the noise but heavy with promise. Another followed, kneeling beside him, tears streaming freely, one hand pressed to his back as if to remind him that he was real, that this was real. The crowd chanted his name, louder and louder, until it filled every corner of the theater. Phones shook as people cried and filmed at the same time, desperate to hold on to the moment. Liam looked out through blurred vision, seeing faces twisted with joy, with heartbreak, with belief. For the first time in his life, he wasn't standing on the outside of warmth, watching through glass. A judge spoke through a breaking voice, calling his performance more than a song, calling it a soul speaking after years of being silenced. Another added that this was why the show existed, why they searched, why they listened. As the gold continued to fall, Liam pressed his forehead to the stage floor, overwhelmed, grateful, terrified, and hopeful all at once. Somewhere between the tears and the thunderous applause, a future cracked open. The boy who had once sung to survive now stood wrapped in light, finally seen, finally chosen.